Timekeeper, ready? Hey, this is Dr. Tyra Hodge. We're back with Parenting Connections and God, Family, and Politics. And so I am super excited today I have an educational rock star. I'm going to get rid of one of these mints. You know, we keep it real here. Oh, lost a mint. I have an educational rock star here with me today. This is Mr. Tim Barton, one of the founders, you would say, like co-founders of Wall Builders.
So my dad started it. I was like 4 when he started it, but I'll take partial credit for that. That's okay.
It's all wonderful, keeping it all in the family. And so I've said this often, and if you know me personally, you always hear me say, hey, Wall Builders does some of the best, has the best information on Black history. It wasn't until I came in contact with Wall Builders that I understood that there were actually Black senators and stuff after Reformation, and or help me if
sure,
I'm wrong, because I'm not a history teacher.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the Civil War, even when you look at June 19th, one of the very interesting things is when the Union Army arrives in Galveston and they make the announcement to all of these Confederate Democrats still holding on to their slaves, and no, the Emancipation Proclamation, it was 2.5 years ago, you have to free your slaves. Well, of those slaves that were freed, 150 of them helped found the Republican Party of Texas.
Okay, so you're going to have to repeat this for the naysayers that say that the Republican Party is at its nature racist, which is a lie.
It's so ridiculous.
And it's a lie. Please say that one more time.
Yeah, so after
Tell the camera.
And a Union general shows up in Galveston, Texas, and says, guys, really, it was the Confederate Democrats still keeping their slaves. Like, hey, you got to let them loose. Abraham Lincoln, 2.5 years ago, did the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the law. You don't have slaves anymore. Of those slaves that were freed, 150 of those slaves joined. Now they're free now. 150 of those Black people joined with 19 white people, and they founded the Republican Party of Texas.
Bam! So this is history that you didn't know. And before I found Wall Builders, I had a lot of misconceptions. And so I am actively on the website. So they have a website. I don't know. I want you to have this, and I want you to tell us some stuff that we may not
Sure.
know. And this is important history because history right now is trying to be covered up.
Right.
And I think it's important that people understand the truth, because what is the phrase about if we don't learn history?
Yeah, those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it. So all the mistakes that people made in the past, if you don't learn from those mistakes, you will repeat them yourself. There's only 2 ways people learn in life: from their own mistakes or somebody else's mistakes.
Right.
And it's way better to learn from somebody else's mistakes, which is part of why we study history, to look back and see what was good, what was bad, what was effective, what wasn't effective. It's one of the reasons that anybody who truly studies history can tell you socialism is not a good idea, because it's never worked anywhere in the history of the world. If you care about having money, which I think that's a great thing, I kind of like more sometimes, right?
Yeah.
All right. I really like having the freedom to make my own choices. Whether it's the clothes that I buy, the food that I eat, where I go, where I spend my time in my life, I like the freedom to live my own life, make my own choices. I like having wealth. I want more wealth. No nation has ever gone socialism. People have never increased in freedom or prosperity. So every time that some nation embraces socialism, they lose freedom, they lose prosperity. Any historian can look back and say that's why socialism is a bad idea, because it never works. But if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes people before you made.
Wow. So that was a whole lot to unpack. And so right now, with our nation is split down the middle.
Yep.
We have racists actually calling other people racist. And I want to be careful because I do lean more conservative. I'm capitalist. That's it. I'm capitalist. That's what I am. That's what I claim. But when we talk about the history of people coming out of slavery, Could you tell us a little bit more about some things that we don't know?
Yeah, so right now there's a lot of things being said that just frankly are very dishonest. A lot of people are lying about America and her history, and in the midst of this, it even goes back to right now, as you every summer we celebrate the 4th of July, or at least traditionally we have, and a lot of people felt like the 4th of July was a disingenuous and dishonest celebration, especially if you are darker skinned, right? If you're a Black American, because this is a white person holiday, at least that's what a lot of woke people are saying today, right? It's a white person holiday. It's not really for Black people, and this is a reflection of how little history we actually know. If you actually study the American Revolution, John Adams says that the revolution began not when the shot heard around the world happened. That happened on April 19th, 1775 on Lexington Green. That was a shot heard around the world. John Adams says the revolution actually began back in 1770, the Boston Massacre, because he says that's when the first blood was shed in the American Revolution. Well, if you back up to the Boston Massacre, who was the person who was killed first in the Boston Massacre? It was a Black patriot named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks had been a slave in the South, escaped to freedom in the North. He became a sailor. He was working on a ship, but he joined up with other patriots in Boston, and they opposed the British. And when the British fired into the crowd, he was the guy at the front of the crowd yelling at the British, opposing them. He was the first life lost in the cause of the revolution. Well, and that's what John Adams says, that's when the revolution started, because that's when the first blood was shed by the British. If you go forward, when the shot around the world happens in 1775, you have Lexington Green, which there were Black and white soldiers fighting together that day. They both attended the church of the Reverend Jonas Clark. So 73 men opposed 700 British. It was Black and white men fighting together. The British go from Lexington Green, they go to Concord Bridge. And Concord Bridge, the Reverend William Emerson led 300 men from his church to oppose the British. The British turn and they go back to Boston. And several weeks later, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is huge historically. The Battle of Bunker Hill is where the Americans had the top of a hill, also known as the Battle of Breed's Hill, but they were kind of on top of the hill, and the British charged up the hill, and the American forces repelled the British. And the British had overwhelming numbers, but they were not able to defeat the Americans. They repelled the first time. They rallied together, they charged a second time. The Americans repelled them a second time, and there's heavy British casualties. A lot of British are getting killed in this thing. The third time they charged, the Americans ran out of ammunition.
Oh, wow.
The British are about to overrun the Americans, except there's one soldier who has one shot left. He shot the officer, British officer leading the charge. It was Major Pitcairn. When he shot the officer falls down. It stops the charge, and all of the Americans escaped. He became the hero of that battle for saving every American life. It was a Black man named Peter Salem.
Peter Salem.
The hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill was Peter Salem. There was another man there, Salem.
Is that in our books? Is that in our history books?
It's not in many history books, and especially not in modern history books. One of the other men who was there was Salem Poor, another Black man, and at the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, there was more than a dozen white officers that came forward and said, we need to promote this man because he was the best fighter, he was the bravest among us. It literally, the heroes of this battle were Black heroes of the battle. If you go through the Revolution, I literally can go battle by battle highlighting that many, in fact, of the heroes of that battle were Black Americans, and not necessarily even always slaves that were fighting for their freedom. Many times it was free Blacks who were fighting in the cause of liberty. But if you go to the end of the Revolution, this is one of my favorite stories. When I look back at America, and I think of American heroes, genuinely, this is one of my favorite American heroes. And I think a lot of times there's a disservice done in America when we have Black History Month so often, people go, well, those are Black heroes. When the reality is, no, those are American heroes.
American, and I say it all the time. I say it all the time before, and I get kind of when I hear African American, because I'm American. Before I am anything else, before I'm a Black woman, I am an American. And until we understand and embrace that, we're gonna still have this feud between, I mean, right now our nation is split, and I only see one side calling everybody racist. I only see one side saying, hey, over there, and somebody that just thinks everybody is racist, you have to be racist. You're talking about what's in your own heart. That's what I think.
If you're going to say somebody's bad because of the color of their skin, that's what racism is.
That's what racism is. And so when you talk about this, are you having conversations about critical race theory at all?
Very much.
I mean, that is racist at its whole nature. It's racist and it's evil. And if you embrace that, then you need to check with God, because you have some evil in your heart. You're racist. You're the person that's racist, trying to put your racism on somebody else, racism on someone else. And so
So I would love to talk about critical race theory. I want to back up and finish the story, because I think one of the most important. No. There's so much to talk about. Because also with critical race theory, I think you can talk about the fact that in life we deal with two kinds of people: the intentional and the ignorant. Right? The intentional, they know they're telling lies. The ignorant might just be repeating what they heard, and they don't know it's not true.
That's true.
And so we want to be strategic, even in having conversations. I don't want to pretend like somebody's a terrible person because they're saying something that is very factually inaccurate if they didn't know. They're repeating a lie. A lot of times they know what they're doing, right? A lot of people know what they're doing. They're intentionally being dishonest. But let me back up. So one of my favorite heroes from all American history is a guy named James Armistead Lafayette.
I know that name.
Well, Lafayette was a French general in the American Revolution, the Marquis de Lafayette. He came to America. When he gets to America, he serves with Washington, and Washington put him in charge of watching all of the British officers, trying to track their movements. So the American forces would know where the British are going, so we could try to strategically be in the right places at the right times. Lafayette realizes the Americans are not prepared. They don't know what they're doing. So Lafayette comes up with several ideas of how he can get this intel he needs. One of the ideas, he comes up with a spy ring. The spy ring, though, was specifically of black patriots. Because one of the things that was true at the time is the British told all black Americans, if you're a slave, come to us and we'll give you your freedom. It's estimated that nearly 100,000 black slaves went to the British. At the end of the war, they freed less than 5,000 of them. What? So they were very dishonest in what they did. Now, with that being said, Lafayette is an American patriot. He's fighting for the Americans, but he knows this is what the British are saying. So he finds these black patriots and says, guys, go to the British camp, pretend to be an escaped slave, and gather intelligence. Come back and report to me. 1781. Benedict Arnold, who was a famous American trader, went to the British, became a British general. He attacked the city of Richmond. Richmond was defeated by the British. When Richmond was defeated, there was a slave in Richmond. His name was James. His master's last name was Armistead, so he was known as James Armistead. Well, James, when he sees his city get conquered by the British, tells his master, I want to fight. I don't want to sit and watch the British destroy everything. The law of Virginia at the time said if you fight for a year, you would be given your freedom. His master knew that, but he said, yeah, James, go fight, that's fine. So his master approved James going to fight, but when James goes to sign up, Lafayette sees him and says, I want you to serve with me, and I want you to be a spy. So James gets sent as a spy into the British camp. It happens to be the camp of Benedict Arnold's, who was the one who just conquered Richmond. Well, James starts serving in the camp. He does such a good job serving just the men, getting them food or drinks or whatever he's doing. Benedict Arnold sees him and says, somebody who serves that good, he should be serving in the officer's tent. So Benedict Arnold literally invites James Armistead in the officer's tent. Benedict Arnold then makes James his personal assistant. Benedict Arnold gets reassigned to go serve under the commander of all the British forces, Lord Cornwallis. So James is now in the officer's tent, hearing every single plan they have. James is getting word back to Lafayette. Lafayette writes Washington a letter. And then you can go back and read Lafayette's letters. He says, I have a brand new spy who is getting me the best intelligence I've ever had from any one of my spies. Wow. This guy is amazing. He's the best spy we've ever had. Well, as the course of the war continues over the next several months, the Americans, because they're getting really good intelligence, are able to start being in the right place at the right time. They're stopping the British. It gets better. The commander of the British, all the British forces, is Lord Cornwallis. James is in his tent listening to all their plans. Well, Cornwallis figures out there's a spy in the camp, but he doesn't know who it is. So he calls an officers' meeting. James is there because he's an assistant to Benedict Arnold, and he's serving in the officers' tent. And Cornwallis says, men, we have a spy in the camp. I don't know who it is, but there's no way the Americans could know all this information unless there's a spy. We need to figure out who it is. We're going to put that man to death. So James is in the tent hearing all this happen. At this point, Lord Cornwallis tells all the officers, everybody leave the tent. He says, James, you stay. So James is now in the officer's tent, right? He knows, like, Cornwallis knows there's a spy in the camp. James is, like, you can only imagine, right? He's like, oh, crap, I'm busted. Like, oh, my gosh, okay. However, Cornwallis does not know who it is, and Cornwallis has a conversation with James, and the way it was reported, he says, James, we both know there's a spy in this camp.
We know.
But I don't know who it is, but I feel like you're probably the one person I can trust. Because I think you probably hate the Americans even more than I do.
Wow.
So I can trust you. So James, I'm going to ask you for help.
Oh my God.
He said, James, I need someone that I can send to the American camp that can gather information and come back and report to me. That way I'll know what the Americans are doing. So James, now, I mean, you can imagine, right? James is having to play this game.
Yeah.
So he's got to be like,
that's
oh.
a double agent, right? That's like the first double agent.
He literally was the first double spy in American history.
Wow.
Oh, and his story's not even done. Because, right, and he's playing the game, right? Like, oh, don't send me back. I hate the Americans. And Cornwallis says, I'll count it a personal favor. He says, okay, for you, I'll do it. James now has free access to both camps going back and forth. As this happens, there's another letter from Lafayette to Washington where he says, remember that spy I told you about who's the best spy in all of my spies? He just got me the word that Cornwallis is moving with 10,000 of his men. They're going to Yorktown. This might be the very moment we've waited for to capture him. Washington says, let's try it. They surround Yorktown, and there's some Providence involved because a strong storm came through and it blew the British fleet out of the harbor, but then it let the French fleet come in, so they bottled up Cornwallis. They end up winning the American Revolution by capturing Cornwallis. Here's what's crazy about the whole American Revolution story. The American Revolution started with the death of a black patriot, Crispus Attucks. And the American Revolution was won because of the work of a black spy, James Armistead.
Can't make this up.
You literally
but
cannot.
You can hide it. Can't make it up.
They're totally hiding it. They're trying to hide it. You literally cannot even tell the honest story of the revolution without including the black patriots who played vital roles. And the end of James' story is amazing because at the end of the revolution, James's master says, okay, you fought, I'm going to turn you free. The laws of Virginia said, new caveat, their state legislature. They said, new caveat. We're not going to count work as a spy to be a year of service because you didn't actually fight. You were just spying. So James wasn't turned free. By the law, he was not allowed to be turned free. Well, his master was actually part of the Virginia legislature. So he goes in front of the legislature and begins arguing that James should be free for what he did. James goes, he worked for French officer, General, the Marquis de Lafayette. So he goes to Lafayette and says, Lafayette, can you help me out? Lafayette writes him a personal note that James takes to the legislature, and James shows them from Lafayette, where Lafayette says this guy did incredible work, valuable to the cause, etc., what he did. The legislature took a vote and approved that they would give James his freedom. Now, this is also important in American history because the southern states had a very different view than the northern states. Right? And people don't often get that perspective. From Virginia down south, you see a lot of pro-slavery mentality from their behavior, even their legislature. But here's where the story of James becomes even more amazing. So James is free. Well, the only last name he had ever had was what his master had. So he was James Armistead, but Lafayette tells him, I want to adopt you. I want to offer you my last name because Lafayette's name had value. He was an amazing American. Everybody loved him. So he became known as James Lafayette. He was given his freedom. He got married, raised a family there in Virginia. Several decades later, James Armistead, this is now in the 1820s, James Armistead is back in America. Excuse me, not James Armistead, Marquis de Lafayette is back in America. He's doing a farewell tour of America, and every American loved him because he's part of the reason that we had the Allies, the French was our allies in the Revolution. And so he's on a carriage riding through Virginia in this town. People are cheering. It's a big deal. Lafayette says, stops the whole parade, gets off his carriage. He went into the crowd because he saw his friend James. He gets James, comes back, he puts James up on the carriage beside him. He tells the whole crowd who this is, the reason that we're here is because of the work this man did. And these two guys like literally ride off into the sunset together on top of this carriage. But literally, when you look back at some of the greatest stories in American history, obviously, as a white guy, I can look back and go, well, that's part of black history. No.
This is history.
This is genuinely
history.
He is genuinely one of my favorite American heroes. Genuinely, American hero. But the way that the narrative is being taught today is you can't hear about even some of these incredible heroes because the narrative is all white people are oppressors, all black people were oppressed. And so even though there's some amazing stories about these incredibly victorious black Americans and black heroes, there's oftentimes people on the other side who don't want to talk about them because it goes against the narrative that they're trying to promote in this Marxist ideology of critical race theory, of saying that, well, there's a group of oppressed and a group of oppressors, and if you're in one of those categories, and that's where it is today, right? If you're in the category, then it doesn't matter. So contrary to what MLK taught. That is more
so
about,
contrary.
It should be about the content of your character, right? Who you are, how you live your life. That's what should matter. But in critical race theory, people say, we don't care who you are and how you live your life. We care what the color of your skin is. And that in itself is one of the most racist ideologies there's ever been.
Very racist. And so, okay, so we only have a couple more minutes. Please tell them about wall builders. Do you go to schools? Do people call you out for schools?
We do.
Like that?
Yeah, we do.
Let them know. Go ahead and tell the camera.
Yeah, so we do different school events, school functions. We'll go and speak at school assemblies, whether it's in person, whether it's like a Zoom or Skype. And so our organization, we do a lot with American history. We have what's considered to be the largest private collection of original documents from the founding era. We have more than 120,000 artifacts, items, and documents. We actually have letters from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. So as we're telling these stories, this isn't stuff that we're just imagining what happened. We actually have the original documents that tell these stories, and many of these stories are so well documented that nobody disputes these stories. It's just people don't tell these stories anymore. And it's one of the great travesties in America. Looking back, one of the guys who's largely responsible for the removal of these black heroes was Woodrow Wilson.
Really?
In 1902. So Woodrow Wilson was a very racist man. Under his presidency, it was the rebirth of the KKK. His administration marched openly in Washington, D.C.
And what political?
He was a Democrat. Interesting. It's
not
probably a coincidence, right?
Not,
okay. So
not.
His administration marched openly with the KKK through Washington, D.C. He showed the very first ever film of the White House, which was Birth of a Nation. It was a recruiting film for the KKK. He gave it 2 showings at the White House. First film ever showed was a recruiting film for the KKK. So this dude was unbelievably racist, terrible guy in his policies. But in 1902, before he became president, in 1902, he was a professor. He wrote a 5-volume set of American history. But this 5-volume set reflects his racism because in his 5-volume set, he removed every single black American, not just heroes, every single black American. Imagine telling the story of the Civil War.
So it was in...
Correct.
It was in there. Wow.
Yeah, we have actual history books from the 1800s that tell all of these stories of these black heroes. So kids grew up learning and knowing these stories, and this was something that abolitionists, leading up to the Civil War, abolitionists were retelling all of these stories, where many abolitionists were trying to tell these other white Americans, many of whom at the time in the South were pro-slavery. They're saying, guys, the only reason we have a nation is because of the work of these black Americans, and you're saying they're unequal, you're crazy for this. These stories were very well known. Woodrow Wilson and his racism writes a series of 5-volume set of history books, and imagine telling the story of the Civil War with no Frederick Douglass.
Wow.
Right? How do you do this?
And see, I didn't even hear of Frederick Douglass. I was working in education. I wasn't a teacher yet, but I was an aide. I didn't even hear of Frederick Douglass until then. I was an adult. And then I didn't even hear all the wonderful black history until I found Wall Builders.
Wow.
And so, and that's way too long. That is way too long to understand and to be able to embrace what we've put into the American culture.
Yeah.
And so, tell them your information, and I think we're right at the close.
So wallbuilders.com is the best place to go to find out more information. A lot of these details, we have a couple books. One's called The American Story. One's called American History in Black and White. That goes into a lot of these stories of these black heroes, some really great things. And one of the things that, for me, I'm a person of faith. I'm a Christian. And so I always come from that perspective of recognizing people aren't perfect, but there is a perfect God.
Yes.
So the way that I think is appropriate in concluding this story is what we say when you look at American history. America certainly is full of wicked, sinful, evil moments because there were wicked, sinful, evil people at different periods of American history, and they did those things unquestionably. There were very dark moments in American history, but it's also worth asking, how did those moments come to an end? And without exception, the people who were the abolitionists? They were the Christians, the pastors, right? It was the churches leading the charge. Every time there were dark, sinful, wicked, evil moments in American history, it was always Christians in the church that fought against that and helped stop that in America. And so by and large, the story of America, it's not the story of a perfect nation or people. It's a story of how a perfect God used imperfect people and did great things in this nation.
He preached. He just preached. Hey, I want to thank you for the show. Please share this out, and especially if you're a history teacher and you work in public education, people need to see this. You need to visit Wall Builders, and also tell them what y'all do once a year.
So we do a teachers conference every single summer. There's a couple different conferences we do, a couple different weeks. It's a 3-day conference, really 2.5 days. And we actually bring teachers in where they can get hands on these original documents. So we'll tell the story, and then we pull out the document and say, and here's where that is. Because one of the things we tell people is don't take our word for it. We don't want you to take our word for it. Don't believe me. Go look it up for yourself, because once you've discovered truth for yourself, nobody can take it away from you. That's why I don't want you to trust me.
Then you're held accountable.
That's it. So we do teachers conferences in the summer. You can find out more at wallbuilders.com, and we'd love to see you there.